Hello, friends, comrades, and interested others. Today I'm just gonna be making a hopefully shorter, unscripted video. I do have a longer or a more high production, I guess, scripted video that is in the process of coming out, but it's probably not going to be out by the end of the month, and given that I've kind of promised to myself and you that I would be making one video a month this year, I figured I would just do more of like a personal talk video about a topic that I'm very interested in and that I've been speaking and thinking a lot about over the past year and a half, couple of years. So I wanted to talk about death. Woo, very exciting, very enthusiastic topic for most people. Death is something that I'm very, very interested in as a topic, as a reality, as an element of life. And have been for the past couple of years. I first spoke about some of the things that I'm planning on speaking about in this video at the People's Assembly for Climate Justice in Toronto, and basically talked about Western relationships to death and how that relates to colonialism and resource extraction and other harmful ways of being in relationship with the rest of the world. And so I guess without further ado, I'll go into what I want to say about this topic. So the West is kind of when I say the West, I mean basically the colonial center, including North America and Europe and Australia. And so the West is known for being particularly thanophobic, and thanophobic means afraid of death. And so all of these theorists who write about death and grief processing have noted, including Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, the author of the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, I think Sogyal Rinpoche is his name, and many other authors that I've been reading over the past couple of years have talked about how the West is particularly afraid and averse of death. And I think the first time that I was exposed to that idea in writing was actually Michel Foucault's An Introduction to the History of Sexuality, which I'm not really a postmodernist, I'm not really that into Foucault, but I did think that he made a really good point when he talked about comparing sex and death in our society, that basically we exist in a society that is actually hyper-eroticized and hyper-sexualized, but we are also under this misconception that sex is a secret that we have to constantly be exposing and constantly liberating ourselves, and that kind of thing that our sexuality is constantly repressed and we need to constantly be arousing it or talking about it or alliterating it in some way, when in fact when you look at our society, when you look at our art and our culture and the things that we talk about, we actually talk about sex a lot. And the thing that we're actually not talking about, if you think about elements of natural life that are actually stigmatized to bring up in a general conversation, the actual public secret of Western life is death. That is not an appropriate topic to bring up at the dinner table. It's generally not something that most people want to talk about among their family, friends, or coworkers, or in any kind of casual regard. And so we kind of push death out of sight. We push death into funerals, and even our funerals reflect a fear of death, where we want to preserve the body so that it looks as lifelike as possible, and we really, really, really can't face the reality of our own physical decomposition and our own edibility, the fact that we can be consumed and eaten by other things in the world, and we can't deal with our own mortality personally and spiritually, the idea that our selfhood will end. And I think that there are reasons why that is. I think that fear is actually not as innate to human life as people seem to think it is, that the fear of death is intrinsic to the human experience. I actually don't think that that's true. And I think that the fear of death, the pathological fear of death, rather than, a baseline, I'm in danger and I don't want to die, I think that that's normal. But I think that fixating on the fear of death, fixating on longevity, fixating on the avoidance of death and the construction of a perception of safety, I think that actually stems from a different, like, social and spiritual and cultural ailment of alienation. And the reason why I think that is that, there are different philosophical frameworks through which a person can view the world. And the Western Enlightenment framework is obviously very individualistic, very focused on personal agency and the individual's freedom and choice, whether that is actually substantiated or not, whether or not that's actually achievable or actually like a practical reality. There's a lot of focus on personal autonomy and personal choice in the West. And I believe the reason why that is that when capital accumulation began, like proto-capitalism, like early accumulation of wealth began, that necessitated dispossessing people from the land. So all of us, historically, thousands of years going back and back, have indigenous traditions from the places that our ancestors are from, and having mutually beneficial land relationships, working with the land in a good way. And so we all have those relationships in our ancestry. And when a people becomes dispossessed from the land, it's actually the severing of a very core spiritual relationship, like an absolutely integral spiritual relationship. Because when it comes down to it, we're factually not, I'm obviously not a Western Enlightenment thinker, but it's also just factually incorrect to assert that we are autonomous beings, because we're not. I did not make my own body. I did not make the clothes that I'm wearing. I cooked the food that I ate this morning, but I did not produce the ingredients. I've never built a house that I've lived in. I've never, willed a plant to grow. Like even, growing a plant or gardening is an act of facilitation. You're not actually doing the work that the plant is doing. I recently participated in this really enlightening webinar called Post-Activism, The World is Alive, and That Changes Everything. I'm probably gonna not do well at pronouncing the person's name, but their name is Bayo Akomolafe, and they're a West African philosopher and post-activist thinker. And they put a lot of these things that I was thinking about into more concise language than I could, and basically talked about how we are fundamentally enmeshed beings, and we are not only ourselves, but we are all of the forces that influence us. We are, the Buddhist way of talking about it would be that creation is a massive, multifaceted gem, and every iteration of creation or every person is a facet, but they are a facet of the same gem. So that type of holistic, entangled philosophy of creation is present in many, many different religions and many cultures and many different worldviews throughout history and throughout, space. And Western Enlightenment philosophy is actually kind of the thing that delves away from this more commonplace, I would actually say, ideology of interconnectedness. And so when you alienate people from the land, which is actually a part of our own bodies, like the Earth system and the ecosystems are a massively complicated series of relationships in which we are all really part of the same organism. So separating a person from the land is a severe trauma, spiritually, psychologically, and physically. And then in order for capital accumulation to work, in order for people to be ideal consumers and workers and producers, it benefits society to isolate people further and further, so that you won't be sharing resources, so that you won't be sharing, your home among multiple generations of your family or anything, and each autonomized person will need to buy their own kitchen equipment and their own food and their own furniture and all these other things. Like you have a much broader consumer market among autonomized people or atomized people. And so when you get that alienation, that is kind of this like cycle of reinforcement of, I'm alienated so I'm afraid of death, and I'm afraid of death, and so I'm alienated. Because when you are deeply interconnected to the land and to your community and to this like intricate web of relations that you are a part of, then your worldview becomes so expanded, your idea of self, your idea of identity, your idea of body becomes so expanded that you understand that you are not only yourself, and that your death is not the end of the world. But when you become isolated, your death becomes this like pathologically terrifying thing, because when you and yourself and your body and your mind is all you have, is the finite limit of your conception of reality, then your death is literally the end of the world. And so it's not, it almost is logically, it almost logically makes sense for an atomized person to fear death, because that is the scope of their world. And so I think that the fact that the West is so alienated and is so isolated, and the West is also this expanding culture that is incredibly afraid of its own death, spiritually, socially, psychologically, and physically, that this is a very mutually reinforcing phenomenon. And when you kind of expand your viewpoint, then you can understand that you are a participant who has a role in the larger life, in the larger body, like a cellular organism. You have a role to play, and you benefit the lives of other people, and you are created out of the materials of the body, and then when you die, your body will decompose and other things will come of it that are still part of the larger body that you're a part of. So it's not so terrifying. Like, we still have the instinctual motivation to avoid death on an incidental basis, but the consuming, philosophical fear of death is a construction, and I do not think that that is a necessary part of human life. I also think that actually reconciling with your own death is incredibly important for living a healthy life. And people kind of in the West often have this idea that speaking of death invokes it, and that if you're talking about death, then you're fixating on it, then you're inviting it, and death is this inherently terrifying monster that you would never want to summon into your life, and so you avoid that by not speaking about it. But what that winds up doing is that people do not prepare for their own deaths throughout life. And unfortunately, you can die at any time, and that's just the way that life is. I've lost several friends over the past few years that were all incredibly unexpected and untimely, and you don't know when your time is going to be up. And so while it's nice to think that we will all live long lives and can kind of put that off, the burden of reconciling with our mortality, and put that off onto our hypothetical future self, we don't know when that's going to be. And so the act of preparing for your own death is in a way an act of preparing for life, that you can alleviate yourself of some of the stress and burden of death by, for example, keeping your things in order. There's a thing called Swedish death cleaning that I can link an article to in the description, and owning less possessions, and making a plan for what happens, what you would like to happen when you die, as soon as possible. These are all practices that can actually help you be much more intentional about what your life means to you, what impact that you're hoping to have on the world, what your goals here are, and how you want to go out of it. Because I think that when you continue to put that off, it results in things like hoarding. It results in, the avoidance of reconciling with other people, because also a fundamental portion of, coming to terms with your own mortality is the ability to reconcile the narrative of your own life. And part of that involves, resolving conflicts with people. And when you are living in a way where you are constantly prepared for your own death, then you do things like trying to resolve conflicts as quickly as possible, trying not to leave loose ends untied. And that not only makes it that you will have less spiritual distress when you do die, but you will have less spiritual distress throughout your life, because you're living in a way that is constantly beginning and constantly closing. You're not leaving things undone throughout your life. So I feel like I'm going on a bunch of different tangents here, but I'm just gonna like roll with it. So the other thing, like death on a larger scale, death is not just the death, obviously, of the physical body. Death, cultures experience death, societies experience death, organizations and governments and empires and any body, and I do count like organizations and principalities as bodies, experience death. And so we have this thing in the West right now that is so terrifying, that we're experiencing this wave of neo-fascism and hyper-militarized police and hyper-militarized borders and the resurgence in white nationalism. And I feel like so much of that is this kind of death denial of, we are coming to understand that the Western Empire is on its way out. And we are coming to understand that the international economic relations of white supremacy is, being brought into light and is no longer going to be the economic model that we are functioning under in the future, either because the planet like dies and we don't exist here anymore, or because we've made radical changes to preserve human life on the planet and we've realized that white supremacy is not part of that plan. So the Western Empire, including the institution of white supremacy, is dying presently. And I'm obviously not nearly the first person to make that diagnosis. But so much of this now reaffirmation and mysticization of Western culture, and you see it in all these different like right-wing YouTube people, all of these different news anchors and like people in the media talking about all the things that the Western Empire has achieved, all these things Canada has achieved and America has achieved and Europe has achieved, and the Greek statues, and trying to like really idealize and reinforce that the Western Empire is something worth preserving because they can sense its death. And it's a denial of death that gets projected on a larger scale, that we cannot accept that the social order we are living under is dying. Because we can't accept our own death. We can't accept death in any manifestation. But the thing is that it's important for the Western Empire to die. And that is not to say people in the West. That is not to say, Americans will die, or Canadians will die, or Europeans will die. I mean, obviously everybody dies, and death is part of life, and death is part of conflict. But to say the West is dying is not to say everyone in this section of the world is dying. It's to say that the institution that has been constructed, that governs that land and people, and that extends imperial power to the rest of the world, is dying. And that is actually a very beautiful thing. And I think that we really need to get to a point in our personal lives and in our communities where we are able to talk about death personally and collectively, and as a philosophical exercise and as a social exercise, because death is part of life. Like, death necessitates, or death is the necessary condition in which life happens. Like, there is so much more death in the world than there is life, and that is good to a certain extent. Like, I'm sitting in this room right now that has wood paneling, and I'm eating, potatoes and turkey sausage, and I'm surrounded by death. Like, the wood that is furnishing this room is dead. The plants that I'm eating are dead. The animals that I'm eating are dead. The soil, the literal dirt that we walk on and that all life grows out of is decay, is dead bodies of plants and animals and people. And so death is this incredibly fertile condition that gives life. And so it's not something that we need to be afraid of. It's not something that we need to construct entire ideologies and ways of being in avoiding. And the real consequence of this as well is that it's unavoidable. There's nothing we can do. put so much resources and effort into Western medicine to extending human life, focusing on the quantity of life over the quality of life, and just extending life as many hours or days or years as possible. And we've reached a very finite cap of that despite the amount of research, despite the amount of ingenuity that's gone into Western medicine, we have not actually extended human life by that much. And especially when you consider things like economic factors and poverty, that medicine that we value so much, that we view as like the great Western accomplishment, is only available to so few, in like not only within the Western Empire itself, but on a global scale is available to so few, because we are so afraid of our own deaths. We clamor for anything that can extend our lives, for anything that can put death out of mind for ourselves and our loved ones. And what that winds up doing is that we actually put off a greater portion of death onto the earth and the land that we're exploiting, onto indigenous peoples and peoples of color around the world, especially like people in the global south. And it's not a net benefit for humanity when one society is so pathologically afraid of death that it cannot reconcile with it, and that it will exploit the land and exploit other peoples to avoid it, because it has results like the chemicals that we extract in order to create the products that extend our lives and ensure us health and safety in the individual sense of health and safety in the West, come at the expense of poor working conditions, dangerous working conditions, like ecological contamination and environmental racism in indigenous communities on Turtle Island, and for communities of people of color around the world. We're not actually improving life. We're not actually improving the quality of human life around the world. We're actually deteriorating it. So the cost of the avoidance of death is manifold and massive. And I think that it's actually an incredibly pertinent and important spiritual mission for people in the West specifically, to change their relationship to death personally and on a broader scale. And I think that in my own, like, I won't at all claim to say that I am perfectly reconciled to death, or that I have overcome this in some way. It's something that I've been actively working on, and spiritually working on and reading about and in conversation about for the past couple of years. I definitely will not say that I have arrived, nor do I ever plan to arrive in finishing that work, but I will say that the practice of working on that, the practice of bringing death into my concept of life, into my plan and understanding of my own life, has liberated me in many ways, and has made me much more open and participatory in my own life, and has brought a huge amount of richness into my life, spiritually and socially. And so I think that it's incredibly worth it to work on confronting your relationship with death, and to work on integrating that into your life. And I think that, yeah, it's actually an incredibly dangerous thing to neglect. And so when you come to understand, like I was saying a bit earlier in this video has wound up going a lot longer than I thought it would, but that when you interrogate where your fear of death comes from, you discover your own alienation. And when you interrogate your alienation and live into your need for community and relationship, which all human beings deeply and intrinsically need, those wounds begin to heal themselves. That in connection with community, and especially also building connections to the land, learning about plants, learning about medicines, learning about the history of the land that you're on, and building relationships, like active, loving relationships with friends and community, that creates the network and, the situation in which you can confront your relationship with death more easily. And so I don't, I guess I just wanted to make this video to kind of put some of these thoughts out there. And I feel like I definitely have more to say about this, but maybe I'll write a blog post about it in the future, or I'm planning on writing a longer article about this topic. If you'd like to visit my blog, I forget to link to that sometimes, but it's capricornrising.net, and I'll link to it in the description. I'll also link some books on grief and mourning that I found very helpful in my own like exploration of this topic. And I will link to my Patreon if you feel like donating to me to help me like make these videos, and also just like support me in the other community organizing work that I'm doing. I would really appreciate that. Yeah, I think that's pretty much all I had to say for today. Thanks for listening to my little ramble. I hope that everybody's having a good day, and I'll see you next time. Peace out.